Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the latest sustainability research seminar. It's been a while since I've been here because I've been on leave. Jenny will be joining us shortly, but this is kind of a newish tradition with our newish comps format that when students pass comps in the fall, they then have an opportunity to present their work in the seminar in the spring. And so today we're actually going to hear from two different PhD students. First, we're going to hear from Brian Grant talking about walking with settler colonization along the Arizona Trail. And then we're going to hear from Leah Shaffer talking about icy intersections, worldview-based decision-making in Arctic frozen commons governance under climate change. So Brian's going to talk for 20-ish minutes, and then we'll hand it over to Leah for 20-ish minutes, and we'll save all of the questions for the end so that we make sure we get to hear from both of them. So I'll hand it over to Brian.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, so a lot of you know me already, but for those who don't, I'm Brian Grant. I'm kind of a long-time PhD student here. I'm kind of in my 5th year, I think. And this is a presentation or a project that I completed in 2021. So it's been a little while. And I want to thank, before I get going, I want to make sure I thank all the people that have sort of helped me process and integrate this into what it is now. So David Manuel Navarrete, my advisor, everyone on my committee, Yvette De Silva, David Carlson, the 2 anonymous reviewers who reviewed my comps paper. Thank you so much. The feedback was extremely helpful. And the whole comps process actually was really helpful. And then just countless other people that I've talked to, maybe some of you in the audience, who have really helped me sort of think about this in different ways and process it. And with that, I will say that this is still an ongoing sort of process. I don't want to present this as if there's some sort of like outcomes that are like conclusions in that way, and that I'm still sort of walking this trail in a lot of ways. Okay. There we go. And so to formally begin, I want to give a land acknowledgement that we are situated right now on the ancestral lands of the Pipash and Akimel Altam people. And in a lot of ways, I think this research was an extension of a land acknowledgement, more of an embodied extension of land acknowledgement. And what does that mean? And in a lot of the same ways that land acknowledgements get critiqued for being performative and problematic, I think the same thing applies to my research as well, which I'll talk about a little bit. To give a little context before I really get into the walking experience, I was approaching this from the lens of settler colonialism as sort of central to unsustainability or unsustainable pathways. And specifically, a lot of indigenous scholars are writing and have written about colonization as a set of unsustainable relationships or extractive relationships with land, people, and knowledge. And particularly Kyle White's concept of relational tipping points, I think is really important for us to consider. I'm not going to go deep into that because if I do, I will be way more than 20 minutes, which is the case for a lot of this. I'm just going to like briefly go over these concepts that are very in-depth. So I apologize if it seems rushed. Relationality is another lens I was approaching this from. And so relationality, hopefully people have heard or are getting familiar with it. I feel like it's becoming more common in sustainability being talked about. But it is an ontological claim at its core, and ontological in the notion of considering what is the nature of reality, what is existence. And so from relational perspectives, reality is assumed to be relationships most fundamentally. So it emerges from relationships, whereas the ontological sort of frame that I have been brought up with was very different in the sense that I would think of like substances as, or individual entities, maybe like subatomic particles, as the fundamental sort of nature of reality that and then interact together and things sort of come into existence that way, right? Relationality is saying, no, it's relationships actually. And relationships in that way means like processes, exchanges, transfers, just interactions between things instead of the things themselves is most fundamental. So this is a big shift. And it also opens up the potential for multiple realities, and reality being constituted by different sets of relationships And in that way, there is no one true reality, right? Which is the ontological way that I've sort of been raised as a Westerner, is to think that there is one way of knowing the world, or there's one world, and maybe different ways of knowing it, but there's one reality, right? And yeah, there's also this strong connection with ontology and epistemology and axiology. Again, I'm not going to go super deep into that, but I do want to say that relationality, while it's not specific to indigenous cultures and indigenous ways of thinking, there are non-Western and even Western relational perspectives, but indigenous ways of knowing have always been and continue to be embedded in relational ontologies, so it's important to acknowledge that. And so I'm sort of thinking in these ways with relationality and settler colonization and sustainability, and then I learn about this Yavapai and Apache Exodus March. So I was born and raised in Arizona. I sort of pride myself on being connected with Arizona and the land. And so when I found out about this, I was pretty shocked that I had never heard about it before. It's an extremely difficult, dark part of Arizona history that does not get talked about. And basically, I heard about this through the Arizona Trail Association, and they had been made aware very recently about a section of the Arizona Trail. So the Arizona Trail is a trail that runs 800 miles from Mexico to Utah, all the way through the state of Arizona. And so there's different sections of that. And one of those sections, and who knows, maybe more, but one specifically was part of this Yavapai-Apache genocidal march that took place in 1875. And this was ordered by Ulysses S. Grant. We share surnames. I don't have any direct relation with him that I know of, but I think that's interesting, right? It sort of gets at this picture that I am connected with these things through my ancestry, right? And the whole notion of this was similar to other forced removals in United States history, like the Trail of Tears, the Navajo Long Walk. Essentially, it was to give us unlimited access to land and be able to do whatever we wanted with it. And so this march was similar to other forced removals, characterized by unimaginable suffering and death. And so the march led these Yavapai and Apache people away from their ancestral lands, which is now what we call the Verde Valley, to the San Carlos Reservation, which is near Globe. But 25 years after they were marched there, they were able to return to the Verde Valley on a reservation, but they returned to their ancestral land. And so they commemorate that return in an annual event called Exodus Day on the Yavapai-Apache Nation, which is close to Camp Verde. And so I'm thinking about that, and I'm like, okay, there's this really dark history that I'm not aware of, but I'm connected with. And how does that relate with this settler colonialism and unsustainability and relationality? And at the same time, I was in a social and cultural pedagogy course, and we were learning about different ways of thinking about pedagogy, but also like opening up to other entities as teachers. And one of the modules, we had a reading where it was an indigenous scholar talking about land as teacher. And I was thinking about that. I'm like, okay, thinking about land in this way, land as a teacher and not just this thing that we walk on, right? Or this material, or however we think about it. And then within that, I also found these walking methodologies. And so there's like a long history of walking methodologies and different types of qualitative research. It's super fascinating. I'm not going to go into all that, but walking with specifically was a concept or a term that was developed by the Zapatistas in their sort of notion of creating a world where many worlds fit. And I felt like that was appropriate because what I was trying to do is sort of open myself up to other worlds and other ways of knowing, other ways of being. And then I found this walking with place methodology that takes this critical sort of decolonial, I would say, they don't phrase it as that, but I would say it's decolonial in the sense that it promotes this unlearning of these dominant assumptions, and it opens up to these erased or disavowed histories, and it's situated relationally. So that was my methodology, was walking with the Exodus Trail, or this passage of the Arizona Trail that was recently exposed as part of this Exodus March. And so in that way, I was trying to disrupt the trail and disrupt the trail from being this place of outdoor recreation, reconnecting with nature, mental health, et cetera, that we usually think of when we think about hiking or something like that. I was disrupting that and sort of reorienting the trail as this place where, or as this route of indigenous genocide, right? And this very deep event that is fundamental to settler colonialism and the way that we live in these societies, in these towns today. And so I'm not going to go through all the research questions. I'm just going to say that method-wise, I relied on arts-based methods like photography because I'm familiar with that, and I feel like it communicates affect or emotion very well. And since this was a very autoethnographic, very personal experience, and emotions were a big part of that, I wanted to have that. I also wanted to explore some relational methods from post-qualitative research. And so I found, or I was introduced to inefficient mapping, which is like an emotional way of mapping landscapes that's very exploratory and arts-based, and also traditional autoethnographic methods, recordings, reflective journaling, et cetera. And I'm gonna skip here. So as I said, I was thinking I was disrupting the trail. It was sort of me acting on the trail. And really what ended up happening is the trail disrupted me in a number of ways. And so these are points on the trail where I experienced specific disruptions that were relevant to sort of seeing myself more clearly in relationship to this Exodus history, in relationship to relational perspectives and sustainability, and being a researcher and educator in sustainability. And so hopefully I can go through all of them. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I will go as quick as I can. The first place that I went was Strawberry Creek, and that's up at the top. And let's see, I have a slide for it. And this is also where I did some inefficient mapping. And so these are a couple layers of inefficient maps that are overlaid on a black and white photo of Strawberry Creek, which is where I was sitting to do these maps. And to do them, you don't look at the paper. That's why they look like squiggles, because you're looking out at the land and sort of mapping the land along with your emotions. And so it's a really interesting method. Again, I'm not going to go too deep into it, but if you're interested, I suggest checking it out. But what I noticed in doing that is it was really challenging a lot of the epistemological bias that I had, like as I was doing it, and then especially during analysis later, I'm like, what is this? Like, how is this relevant? You know, I was really sort of challenging the boundaries of what I considered knowledge. And it took me a little while to really sort of feel into that and look at it with some clarity around, like, yes, there is emotions that you communicated in here that are valuable for your insight into what you experienced here. And I could talk about this specific place for a long time because it was pretty heavy, but I will just say that the power lines that were laid across this creek, I don't know I have no like way of knowing if that was part of the Exodus march route or not, but it just felt very metaphorical and symbolic, thinking about the extractive energy that often goes into energy production. And then the fact that these power lines are going to these towns, Strawberry is the closest town, but also Pine, Payson, that I've visited many times as like getaways, right? As like vacation places. And thinking about them in this context of settler colonialism and genocide, it puts a much different spin on being with those places that I think is important to consider. And so then I made my way, so Strawberry Creek was actually not at this trailhead where I started. It was a little bit like a couple miles north of that. And so I made my way to the actual trailhead where I began officially walking what would be the Exodus section of the Arizona Trail. And this scene right here immediately sort of struck me as degraded and sort of a lot of metaphor in there. And then I noticed this sticker on one of these trailers, these horse trailers, that really spoke to me because my dad's side of the family is a lot of farmers and cattle ranchers. And so, and to protect and care for all his creations, God made ranchers, miners, and loggers. And it kind of brought up a lot of the Judeo-Christian sort of beliefs that I was raised with. And I was thinking of those in the context of how I relate with nature and how I sort of understand nature, which was very anthropocentric. And so I was making those connections as I began. Then this place, the juniper trees along Saddle Ridge, I really got acquainted with this notion of non-human agency that is pretty obvious, but it's very obvious when you're confronted by a black bear who I didn't actually see this black bear, but he was very close, growled at me. He or she was very close, growled at me. And I've never heard the growl of a black bear before, but as soon as I heard it, I knew exactly what it was. And I was extremely terrified, vulnerable. And it was something that for whatever reason, I knew that this area there was a high concentration of black bears, but I just didn't think about it in the planning and preparation for the trip, partly because I was really caught up here thinking about other things. So it really connected with me with this like notion of, you're not the only being out here, right? There's a lot more going on that you need to consider. And then I made my way to a place where I actually set up camp that was not on my route, but I was making slow progress. So I found this campsite and it was just too good to pass up. So I camped solo, and it was my first time camping alone, where I didn't see anybody aside from the horse trailers. I didn't actually see one person the whole time I was out there. And to my knowledge, there wasn't anyone around for miles. So I was completely alone in the pitch dark, and it was cold. I went in February or January, and there was no wind and there was no moon. So it was just dark. As soon as I put the fire out, it was dark. And I started to get really terrified. Like I had thought I left being afraid of the dark in childhood, and I definitely did not. I was terrified. But what it really brought up was I just started questioning, like, why am I even out here? Like, clearly I'm not prepared for this. I don't know what I'm doing. And I started questioning a lot of these academic intentions that I had and thinking about the Exodus in this way. And then I started thinking about it in like the context of extractive research, because although I did reach out to some people from the Yavapai-Apache Nation, I never actually got permission from anyone to walk the Exodus Trail, even though this is the Arizona Trail that anyone can walk. Like I was walking it with this perspective, right? And that really started to bother me. And yeah, I just was starting to feel more and more alienated by that whole process. So then the following day, super tired, I made my way to the East Verde River, which was sort of my turnaround point. And that is because it was mentioned in some of the historical accounts I read of the Exodus March. And there was lots of reflection and things going on there. But what happened that was really important for this is when I was leaving the creek or the river, I fell in this seep and was completely covered in mud. Like you can see my shoes are completely covered in mud. I had no other socks. I had no other shoes. And I had to walk about 12 miles back to my car. So I was really frustrated, but it really was a point where I felt myself let go of a lot of the stuff that I was thinking, theories, history, like publishing, analyzing data, all these things. And I let go of that and was just like there with the land, right? And so it was like this point where I sort of opened up to land as a more than human agent, or land as something more than just this inert thing that I was walking on, right? I was making this connection of like, okay, the land is actually teaching me something, right? And it's teaching me to let go of thinking to experience thought, which I'm not gonna dive super deep into right now. But and then on my way back, I walked straight through, trying to get back to my car before it was dark. My feet were super blistered, soaked, and then I got lost. And I had a GPS, but it wasn't working well. And then my phone died, and I couldn't find my headlamp. I thought I lost it. It actually ended up being in my backpack, but I didn't find that until months later. So I was alone in the dark, and I was, again, alone in the dark and feeling very just vulnerable and like I did not belong there. And I started to understand more and more that like a lot of my connection with the land is based on this sense of control that I have over the land. And it's related to a lot of these extractive relationships that we have, where we think of ourselves as sort of having ownership or being able to, use land in these ways. And then when I was out there, it was very clear that I was not in control. And I found that very valuable. So to sum up, how much time have I got? Okay, sweet. So why is this important? What did I get out of this? It was really important for, I think, setting or orienting me on the rest of the path of my dissertation, because it allowed me to sort of explore what I'm talking about here, relational sustainability or relationality as it relates to sustainability, explore what that meant for me as a researcher, educator, and it really showed me that relational ethics and relational accountability is so vital in doing this type of work. And so that was one of the big things that actually, when I came back from this and I started talking with people about it, I was talking with this guy who does memory work, is what he calls it, but he does these lynch tours in parts of the Midwest where there was lynchings, and he was like, the first thing that you should have done was got permission from these people to walk with their memories. And the fact that you didn't do that, it undermines the whole thing. And so while I did try to reach out, I never actually got permission. And so it really illustrates this lack of relationship that I have with these Yavapai and Apache peoples and the indigenous communities here, the Peapach, the Akimel Altum. I don't have relationships with those peoples. And so to do work with their memories is unethical. And so I was thinking about that in a lot of different ways, but especially as it relates to working with indigenous knowledges and ontologies. Like, I think that's something that we should be aware of, that even knowledge and, ways of being or ontological, assumptions about reality, like, we can't just use those in our work without having some sort of accountability to the people that steward those ideas, that steward those knowledges. And so it has this relevance to decolonization for relationality, or decolonization towards pluriversal thinking, being open to diversities of knowledges as well as diversities of ontologies or pluriversal being. And so I think this decolonial aspect is really important to consider. And especially for myself as a non-Indigenous white settler, it was very important for me, and it continues to be very important for me, to go beyond just intellectual understandings of these things, do a lot of reading and things like that, but the actual experiences are what really deepened a lot of this for me and really communicated to me, again, like the relational ethics part being so important. And also just experiencing what it's like to be with land in this more than human sort of way, or this being with land as an agent, which is not something that then I just changes my entire perspective. Like, I went back, as soon as I got to my car, I felt an incredible relief, and I drove home, and it was like a lot of this was just gone. I was back to thinking in the status quo of, land is just this thing that I am on and whatever. So it's like, this has to continually, for me at least, be cultivated. And so that is kind of what I'm exploring with my dissertation now, is conceptualizing this term that, thanks to people that I've been talking with and some of the reviews, relational awareness seems to be sort of what we're getting at here, relational awareness for sustainability. So conceptualizing that and making the case for how that fits in with like relational sustainability research and education, but also how that fits in with larger sustainability transformations that are focused on more psychological or inner dimensions. And then within that, exploring spiritual practices and other practices, maybe like walking, that can cultivate that relational awareness and help us continue to cultivate it. Because again, it's not like you do one thing and it just changes you forever, right? It's a continuous process that has to keep unfolding. So yeah, that's what I mean. A lot of ways I'm still walking the trail. Thank you.
Thanks. Which button is it? Oh, cool. Hello. So my name is Leah Shaffer. I am a fourth year PhD student here in the School of Sustainability, and I am going to present Icy Intersections Worldview-based Decision-Making in Arctic Frozen Commons Governance Under Climate Change, which is what I wrote about for my comprehensive exam. And now that I'm standing up here with a microphone and saying it out loud, I'm thinking I should put it into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT to make it a shorter title for me. So for my comprehensive exam, I did the grant proposal option. So a lot of what I'm going to present today is kind of the theories that I'm thinking about, some very preliminary like pilot research, and a lot of like background. So to start with that background, the work that I am going to talk about today is part of a larger NSF-funded grant that I'll just refer to as the Frozen Commons Grant. This is a collaborative research with two communities in Alaska, McGrath, Alaska, and Nikolai, Alaska. And I wish I had a laser pointer, but I put little stars on that map of Alaska. So the red star is McGrath, the yellow star is Nikolai. And then all those lines running more or less north to south in Alaska is actually the Alaska road system. And as you can see, the road system does not go out to McGrath or Nikolai. So the way to get out there is by flying on a small plane that can be anywhere from a 2 to 3 seater up to a 9-seater plane. Yes, I have flown on those planes. Yes, it is scary. I won't say more about that now. So what are frozen commons? Frozen commons are landscapes composed of interconnected ice, snow, and permafrost that have been and are currently collectively governed by communities, rights holders, and stakeholders, both in Alaska all the way out to the international level sometimes, depending on kind of what exactly the landscape is. So sea ice in particular can be considered a frozen commons, though it's not the frozen commons I work on. And it has a lot of kind of international interest and governance. And the work that we're doing is highly collaborative. So we have partners in McGrath and Nikolai who have lived there their whole lives. Sometimes they have deep place-based knowledge that come from family roots back thousands and thousands of years. And we have hired research leads in the communities, and we're working on setting up a committee in both communities to help guide the research process and the questions that we're asking within this research. And then another part of this grant that I don't work directly on, but I think is super cool, so I really like to mention it, is ArtsLink and PhotoVoice, which is bringing together artists, scientists, local and indigenous knowledge from the far north to kind of co-create knowledge from lots of different methods and perspectives on how frozen landscapes are changing. So this is all part of the grant that I'm working on. And my work in particular focuses on governance. So, well, governance and landscapes. So this is a map of the upper Kuskokwim River area, which is where McGrath and Nikolai are located. You can see McGrath is labeled on the west of the map, Nikolai is on the east, and all of those different brightly colored areas are patches of the landscape that are governed or managed by a different stakeholder or rights holder. So the yellow is a regional stakeholder at the kind of placed in between the local and regional level. That bright purple is also a regional stakeholder, but it's sort of at the regional state level, so a little bit sort of farther out. And then everything that looks like it's not labeled is actually governed by the state of Alaska, primarily the Department of Natural Resources. And then there are those sort of little patches of blue, which almost blend in with the purple, so I apologize for that, which are governed by the federal government, particularly the Bureau of Land Management. But also threaded throughout these land patch governance rights are entities that make decisions or govern how people can move, where they can move, and when they can move there, and then also who govern essentially species. So when we think about the Alaska Department of Fish and Game or the federal Division of Fish and Wildlife Service. They write laws and policies about what people can do in terms of hunting, fishing, and gathering. So people who live in McGrath and Nicolai essentially have to, well, they move through these landscapes for everything from ecosystem-based livelihoods, so subsistence livelihoods, to connecting with other communities, both between the two here and other communities that are not on this map. They move through the landscape for recreation. They move through the landscape for cultural connection. And as they're moving through this landscape, which because of climate change is changing very quickly, they have to sort of contend with all of these different stakeholders, all of the different decisions that are being made on the land that can and often do change through time. And the changes in governance and decision-making don't always match up with the changes on the landscape due to climate change. And the reason that we're focusing on frozen commons in particular and frozen landscapes is because the sort of, well, it's Alaska, so it's frozen much of the year, not the whole year, which I do like to point out because some people seem to think it stays frozen in the summer. It does not. But in the wintertime, everything freezes over and the river becomes a really important way to move across the landscape. It gets way easier and way faster to move across snow and ice on a snowmobile instead of, like, there are no cars out here, right? You saw that the road system doesn't go out that far. There are roads locally, but in the summertime, there are gravel or dirt roads. They can be really damaged because of like rainwater and erosion. But in the wintertime, they're perfect, right? It's just packed snow. Transportation gets way easier. And the frozen landscapes also support the ecosystem in a way that is really important to the communities. So the communities have mentioned one really good example of this is that snow in the wintertime is very, very important for the growth of berries in the summertime. So the local communities here have noticed and recognized that in low snow winters, those are always followed by low berry summers. And the berries in Alaska are pretty much the only sort of fruit that grows. They're one of the only and definitely one of the most plentiful sort of plant-based foods that people in these communities can gather and incorporate into their diets. So that's the focus on frozen landscapes. And as people are moving through these landscapes, like I said, they have to contend with all of these different decision makers. So first, I want to just sort of state my definition of governance that I'm running with. So I am defining governance as the norms, rules, and processes that determine how power and responsibilities over resources are exercised, how decisions are made, and how different people participate in these processes. And I really like this definition because I think it links very well into the idea that governance is multi-level. And so when I say multi-level governance, I mean the hierarchies that are nested, so nested hierarchies of decision makers who are making decisions for resources. And with this nested hierarchy comes differing levels of power and differing amounts of information about the landscapes, the resources, and the people that these decisions affect. So in interior Alaska, with these frozen landscapes, the federal government is sort of the highest level decision maker. And when they make a decision at the national level, which maybe they're thinking a little bit about Alaska, but they're probably mostly thinking about the lower 48 states, that decision then constrains the choice set that the state is able to use to make a decision specifically for Alaska. And that decision that the state makes then constrains what regional and local level entities can do and can decide on. And the local and regional levels, on the other hand, have that sort of place-based knowledge. They recognize what's going on. They're living it every day. They're moving across the landscape. And they are trying to communicate information up to the state and federal level, who are sort of making those like broad decisions that then affect the decisions the local people can make. And so because of these sort of differing levels of power and knowledge, my work is focused on how worldviews integrate into decision-making and governance. And I really like that I was paired with Brian to do this, because I think a lot of what you talked about in your presentation about sort of like relationships and ontologies, everything that you talked about is really incorporated into what I am sort of defining as a worldview. So a worldview can be held by an individual person, and that's usually how we think about a worldview. But I'm arguing in my research that a worldview can also be held by an entity or a group or sort of a broader level stakeholder. And a worldview is a combination of values, goals, priorities, epistemologies, ontologies, mental models, the way we understand relationships between different things, such as human nature relationships and human culture relationships, as well as our perception of a particular challenge and our perception of what solutions may be relevant. And I know that sort of people are understanding what I mean when I say worldview, because they all sort of do this same thing, all the way up from my dad, who is a microbiology teacher, to my very best friend in the world, who is a resource economist. When I'm talking about worldviews, they get it, and they always do the same thing. They sort of take their hands and they go, oh, it's like when two people are having a conversation and they're saying the same thing, they're talking on the same topic, but they're talking past each other. And they sort of do this with their hands. And I'm like, yes, you get it. They're talking past each other. And because of these different worldviews that they hold, they don't quite have the ability to understand and perceive exactly what the other person is saying or meaning, even though they're using the same language, they're using the same words, and they're talking about the same topic. And so my argument is that worldviews are both integral, but also largely unconscious and unexamined in governance decisions, in governance conversations and decision-making. And this is really important because a worldview allows us to go beyond what an entity is saying and start to understand why they're saying it. And in a multi-level world, decision makers can hold vastly different worldviews, but they need to be working together as landscapes, particularly frozen landscapes, are changing very, very quickly in a way that is really impactful to people's lives and livelihoods. And so I address this through semantic network analysis. My approach starts with mission statements of the 33 entities that make decisions for land in the Upper Kuskokwim River area that I showed you the map of. I just have 3 examples today because it's really hard to fit 33 mission statements on a single slide in a way that is actually readable. And I chose 1 example at the local level, 1 example at the state level, and 1 example at the federal level. And I also want to say this mission statement work is very preliminary. I sort of used it as a pilot study to refine the method. It didn't even really start out as semantic network analysis, but that's where it ended. And so I use these mission statements to pull out different parts of the sentence and think about how the different parts of the sentence relate to each other. So I pull out the subject, the verb, the object, the beneficiary, so who is an entity doing its stated work for? And then also the process. And so process is usually an adverbial phrase in the mission statement. It is not something that I was originally looking for, but sort of through iterating over the mission statements, I noticed it as something that was in many of them and sort of felt important to the worldview. Particularly, the thing that kind of clued me in is the mission statement of, at the federal level, the US Fish and Wildlife Service. They mention that they are addressing their goals through working with others. And I thought this was super interesting because it was the only mission statement in the 33 that highlighted any sort of like aim toward collaborative work. But these mission statements allow me to pull out themes that appear both within a level and across levels. And this is how I'm starting to sort of address worldviews for like a stakeholder at the entity level as opposed to an individual. How much time have I been up here? I have 5 minutes left. Okay, cool. So I'll go through this relatively quickly, but there are 3 themes that I wanted to highlight today. The first is a theme around extractive verbs. So many of the 33 entities, their mission statements mentioned development, maximizing resource use, maximizing profit, enhancing the landscape. Enhancing is kind of a wishy-washy verb. Like it could mean sort of protecting, it could mean maximizing and developing. It's not super clear. Oh, and I guess I kind of skipped over why I chose mission statements is because they have to be short and concise. And so I am kind of holding the assumption that a lot of thought goes into writing these mission statements, picking exactly the right word, and they also are public facing in a way that is meant to communicate what the entity does, what their broad goals are, and how they are trying to do that. So that's why I started with mission statements. So the next theme that I wanted to pull out that I thought was super interesting and I kind of didn't see coming is this theme around temporality. So in that first local level, which is the McGrath Native Village Tribal Council, they mention both working for the benefit of future generations, but also building on the wisdom of past generations and elders. And they are one of the only entities that talked about either the future or the past, knowledge from the past. And at the state level and the federal level, the entities are current in the current time. And I think this is interesting because climate change is sort of stretching far into our future. It's going to be here for a while. How is an entity that works with the natural landscape going to do that effectively if they aren't thinking about how things are changing in the future? And I couldn't make this joke or point the last time I presented an earlier iteration of these slides because I was presenting to a room of Alaska state workers, and I need them to be on my side at least until they agree for me to interview them about this stuff. And then the third theme that I want to pull out really quickly is this theme around verb misalignment. So we noticed that a lot of the state and federal entities, they use verbs that are in direct contradiction to each other, sometimes in the same sentence, in the same phrase, like geared toward the same object or the same subject. And so like the best example of this is the Department of Natural Resources. They want to both develop and conserve. And at least based on my personal worldview, these 2 things are in direct conflict. And so how does that work, right? And these are sort of some of the questions that I'm asking. And so future iterations of this work will dive into full-length documents published by these different entities, all the way from resource management plans, annual reports, maybe like meeting minutes, budgetary documents, kind of across the board. So digging much deeper than just the mission statement and sort of looking beyond these like really short and concise statements to like what entities are actually doing. But it'll be sort of the same method to address worldviews. So the main takeaways that I want to mention, the first is that worldviews do matter. So they allow us to go beyond what people say and understand why they're saying it. And this is really important in helping us highlight in these collective decision-making conversations where conflict may come up, where processes of decision-making may be slowed or halted, and also what sort of thing is supporting collaborations, where are effective collaborations coming from? And second is we live in a multi-level world. And that's really important because with a multi-level system of governance come multiple levels of power, and how these multiple levels of power interact with very different worldviews is sort of a super interesting question that I'm addressing through this work. And then third, frozen landscapes are changing very quickly and action is needed. And this just sort of draws from those first 2 points that these conversations are collective, decisions need to be made, like we need to kind of get moving on this. And so how are worldviews and how is the nature of multi-level governance sort of playing into conflict and collaboration as action is needed? So yeah, shout out to NSF for funding this work. And thank you so much to our community partners, the McGrath Native Village Council, the Nikolai Edzino Village Council, the City of McGrath, and the City of Nikolai. Thank you.
Great presentation, Leah. I was curious, you talked about it a little bit, but like, what's your perspective on the role of ontology in relationship to worldviews? Like, how do you see that? I know that's a big question, but.
I think, yeah, this is still on. So honestly, I haven't thought super carefully about that question. So we sort of defined worldviews as like a mix of all of this. I'm doing this work with Dr. Shauna Byrne-Silver over in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change. And she teaches a little bit about worldviews in her graduate class, Changing Human Nature Relationships. And the way we talk about it is sort of just a worldview is built from kind of your place in the world, how you were raised, the things going on around you, your personal experiences, and the way you form relationships with everything around you, and that all kind of just compacts into your worldview. And so I would say I haven't thought really carefully about specifically how ontology relates to worldview. Sorry.
Anthropology stuff that I've read some anthropology work that is talking about ontological difference as sort of an entry point into understanding these types of perspectives from people. So that's why, yeah.
So, Brian, I have a question for Brian, and so great presentation. It's a lot of stuff that I was learning anew. I didn't know you could do an auto-ethnographic study. That was very fascinating to me, and I think that speaks a lot to, for lack of a better term, my worldview, I guess, of looking at the physical world. But I was trying to, I think, a little bit of, a political economist looking at the work, trying to think about what exactly were you trying to understand, and how can that type of, is this like more or less was the methodology more or less what like an historian would use when they're talking about what has happened in the past? Um, how can, if I wanted to replicate what you did and I didn't have the energy to walk 15 miles, or I definitely did not want to stay outside in the dark, how can I do something like that? And please excuse my ignorance here. I come from, I don't know, the hard sciences, where I'll be like, oh, that should be an opinion piece. But how can I think about that from somebody who's completely different, but also open to understanding, and also open to probably trying some methods like that?
Yes, Tam, thank you so much for that. And I'm so glad that, because, we chat all the time, so it's like really cool to actually share my work with you. And a lot of what you said are things that super important. And so I guess I can start with the replicability part, because I am in no way advocating that anyone should replicate what I did. Actually, probably the opposite, right? And or at least if you're going to try to work with something like that, at least make sure that you have permission and some sort of relationship with the people whose memories you're working with. Um, and what I think I was really trying to understand was very personal, right? So I'm not trying to make some sort of generalization, but really looking more for personal insight into my own relationships with land, settler colonization, and as an educator and researcher in sustainability, like that's really what I was looking for, is more insight into my own relationships. Or I would like to use Wa Theongo's concept of decolonizing the mind. And specifically, he talks about that in as a process of seeing ourselves more clearly in relationships with ourselves and other selves in the universe. And so I think about it as this was like sort of a walk to see myself more clearly in relationship to all these things I'm in relationship with. And I think that was, yeah, that was a big part of it. So that was the autoethnographic and decolonial sort of lens there. Yeah, what else did you? There was one other part I'm missing to your question. I forget.
I think you answered most of it, but more about what I was trying to figure out is, I mean, you answered essentially, talking about how this was you personally trying to figure out yourself, because I wanted to know how can this be replicated, and what exactly would this, or what the purpose per se, how can this be useful to, for example, the indigenous communities whose memories that you say you're using, something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that kind of goes along with the relational accountability part that I did not have, is because you're exactly right. Like in this situation, there should have been more accountability. It should have been more of a shared process where there is at least some sort of relationship with the Yavapai-Apache people. And the fact that there wasn't, again, it undermines the whole intention of walking the Exodus trail, because that's not really what I did. I really just walked the Arizona Trail as a white guy with a lot of ignorance around, my relationships with this land and the people that are ancestral to this land. So, yeah, I, there should have been more of a relationship there in order to do this type of work. And then as far as like how it's useful, I'm there's a lot of I say a lot because I'm reading a lot of it. Maybe there's not a lot in general, but there's certainly an emerging sort of thread looking at relationality and relational approaches to sustainability research and education and science in general. And so I think this is a contribution to people that are interested in that, especially people that are coming from my same background as non-Indigenous people, as settlers who are very conditioned in different ways and like our ways of thinking about the world. If you're going to enter into relational research, these are things that you might want to consider, especially like how do we actually experience relationality? Because that's not, at least for me, that's not part of my experience. I don't experience the world as relational. And so this walk and other things that I'm doing currently are ways to try to actually experience that and understand it from more of an embodied perspective and not just the intellect, because I think the intellect is limited in this regard. So yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, both of you, for your presentations. I really appreciate them. My question's for Brian, though. Would you consider in the future walking again with permission? And how might that expand or, you know, make your experience different?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked because there is, I mentioned the Yavapai-Apache Nation does an annual Exodus Day commemorative event. They also do a relay where they basically do relay to retrace this whole Exodus route. And from my knowledge, it's not necessarily open to people who are non-Indigenous or not part of Yavapai-Apache Nation. It would be interesting, though, to take part in something like that, or at least be an observer or something to get more of a relationship there. And also, speaking of, for the last 2 years now, my family and I have planned on attending Exodus Day, and both years my kids have been sick, and so we didn't actually go because we didn't want to get anyone else sick. It happens to be in February, which is cold and flu season, and when you have a 2 and 6-year-old, they tend to be sick a lot. So haven't actually made it there, but it's definitely something that is going to happen. And I mean, that extends out to, like, I feel like it's really important for myself to also find ways to build relationships with the indigenous communities whose land we're on now. And so those seeds are sprouting as well, I think, in different ways. And also just the way that I interact with land more generally, because I ride mountain bikes and hike and things quite often. So since this walk, I've really made it a point to try to at least give some sort of reciprocity with the land. And it could be even just through words of just saying thank you and sort of, thinking with the land and as like in a more than human sort of sense. But it's definitely changed the way that I approach, being out in the wilderness, so to say, or something. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Just for edification, my name is Brandon Russell. I'm an undergraduate here, returning student in the College of Global Futures. And I just want to say thank you for what is actually a very artful presentation. I really enjoyed the contrast, both by imagery of battling through the elements and in the cold of Alaska, and of course your story about the interaction with the wildlife. And really enjoyed also the contrast that was presented with the linear mapping of Bureau of Land Management and the nonlinear mapping of other indigenous communities. And as you presented your research, it's new to me, but being an undergrad, I'm maybe elder by age, but more youthful in wisdom. If I were to continue your research, hypothetically, what type of things would you want to see involved in that?
You want to take this one?
Can-
Okay. Yeah. So what kind of things would I want to see if you were trying to? Yeah, I think. Well, again, like this concept that I'm sort of working towards, which is relational awareness for sustainability. I think that's more where at least I would see myself as like a non-Indigenous settler that's interested in, opening up to more of these Indigenous and non-Western ways of knowing, is like, what is this like? What is relational awareness and why is that important? Or maybe it is important for us to do this type of work. And so that's more on this personal level, but I'm also going to be working with some communities, spiritual communities, because spiritual practices have been sort of the way that I've maintained some of the things that I learned on the trail, but quickly dissolved when I go back to my day-to-day. So I see spiritual practices being part of that, like remembering, or that, you know, continuing to cultivate that space. So that's more where I'm looking. So I think it's interesting that for people to be doing more of that, like inner sustainability work that's also like coming from this decolonial relational perspective. Yeah, but I think everybody's work is good, so.
I would love to see more worldview research integrated into sort of the broader research agenda. It is something that has been a part of the literature in terms of like how individuals make decisions. It's part of the literature in like philosophy and religion, but it's really not part of the literature in terms of governance and decision making and climate change. And I think that it could be a really powerful way to think about policy processes, especially in terms of worldviews at the entity level instead of at the individual level. Because when we sort of think about like what is guiding progress forward, how the world around us is like kind of formed and created, like what is guiding those systems, it's really like entities, divisions, businesses, and corporations that are making those decisions that really matter, especially in terms of sustainability and the climate crisis. And so I think integrating more worldviews into that could give us a really interesting way to sort of think about like where progress is coming from, where it's going, and like ways to think about shifting that and supporting like better kind of power equity amongst different stakeholders and rights holders, and also supporting collaborations between like very different groups. So yeah, that's what I think would be cool to see.
Yeah, thank you for both presentations. It was great to hear both together also. I think it was a great combination. I was looking at that banner over there. Our world is trying to tell us something. To thrive in the future, we must rediscover our planet and our relationship with it. We need a vision for better that brings all the voices on the table and focuses on long-term opportunity. So I was wondering, well, particularly for Brian, how do you see your research connected to that? And for Leah, also, you mentioned power several times. I was wondering, how do you see the connection between worldviews and power, or how can you operationalize or treat power in relation to worldviews? Because of course, if there is only one worldview, or one worldview that has overwhelmingly more power than all the others, then okay, we can map everything. But you know, it's not really. It looks like a key thing, and I was wondering how you are gonna deal with it.
Yeah, I can start because I haven't. Okay, and then I'll pass it to you. Yeah, so I think a lot of governance decisions are guided by the sort of Western extractive worldview. If anyone in the room wants to argue with me on that, I think that could be really interesting, but I'm sort of guessing the company I'm in that's probably not the case. And that sort of worldview around like progress, economic growth, extraction, it really has the power right now. And when we think about non-Western worldviews, indigenous worldviews, place-based worldviews, those are usually, you know, local people who don't have much decision-making power, who are not necessarily incorporated into collaborative decision-making conversations. And even when they want to be part of those conversations, the sort of multi-level nature of these decision-making structures make it very hard for them to break into these conversations in a way that their voice is heard and they can kind of leverage the little bit of power that they may have. And this is something that we have heard voiced by the communities that we're working with. And so I think that worldviews only matter because there is such a differential in who has the power in decision-making conversations. And if sort of across the board, power was distributed in a more equitable way where sort of a myriad of voices, you know, could join these conversations, could share their knowledge, could really sort of discuss pathways forward and like relevant solutions, that like studying worldviews would almost be less interesting maybe, because all of the worldviews would be sort of equal in that space. And there would sort of be less need to sort of figure out like, why is what we're doing not working well? Where is that coming from? Why are we still doing it if it's not working well? And like, where do we go that's better? And I think that's really where worldviews come in and can potentially play an incredibly important role in these conversations. Where did you go?
Thanks. Yeah, that's super interesting too. I want to talk more about with you, but and David, yeah, thank you for pointing that out because that is I didn't actually read it, but it's very relevant. And I think also kind of thinking about what you're talking about too. Part of the other sort of decolonial perspective that I am working with more in my work is this notion of unlearning, specifically unlearning dominant assumptions or unlearning dominant, you could say worldview maybe, in order to open up towards other ways of understanding the world, being with the world, things like that, right? So it's like our world is trying to tell us something. That's pretty clear, but how do we hear it, right? I think in order, and how do we hear it and what do we hear, those two things are super important and are based on how we conceive of the world, right? I mean, do we think of the world as an entity or an agent that is capable of teaching us things, or do we think of it more as like a system that is, you know, there's certain markers that are telling us, you know, we need to intervene in certain places. Like there's very different interpretations that follow from that sort of thing, right? And that's, I guess, kind of getting at this relationship between how we think of the world or how we understand the nature of the world and how we then determine what can be known or what knowledge looks like with the world. So this connection with ontology and epistemology, I think is something that we're also, or I'm trying to explore more. And rediscover our planet and our relationship with it. Yeah, that's exactly right. So in my opinion, I think sustainability science in general is really about reconnecting people with nature or with the earth in different ways, right? And we have many different lenses of doing that, whether it be like a systems perspective or more of a relational perspective. I mean, not that those are separate necessarily, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say. And reconnecting to nature, I think on this more ontological level is what I was sort of after, right? As like reconnecting with the earth as more than human agency or as entangled agency, like reconnecting with the earth as not just something that humans can use and extract and act on, but it also acts on us. And we need to be aware of and acknowledge that. And bringing better voices to the table. I also think that a lot of the relationality paradigm is very relevant to working with other ways of knowing and opening up sustainability to more what they call pluriversal or like epistemologically diverse, I know it's a little bit of a mouthful, but ways of working within sustainability. And so bringing voices to the table like you're doing, but on a more horizontal plane, I think requires at least some level of unlearning, right? And being able to step back from the assumptions that we're often unconscious of as Westerners, or Western trained academics or governance officials. There's often these unconscious bias that we have towards our ways of thinking and knowing the world And that's been written about a ton in sustainability. And I think relationality has a big potential to help us address that and open up this more horizontal way of weaving knowledges together.
Okay, so we have a couple more minutes. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Hi, great talks, really fun to see. Brian, I wonder, as we think about relationality and kind of shifting the focus of what we think of as research rather than being about a subject, but being about the process or the relation, is there a contradiction in using an autoethnography as an approach where the focus is one element of a relation rather than the relation itself? And how do you study a relation as an individual PhD student? Is there, I mean, you gestured you need permission and, you know, a relationship, but is there, does it also require something of other actors, human or non-human, more than human, to actually get at what the subject of the research is about? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely hadn't thought about it that way, and I think it's really important. And what I would say is, I mean, yes, obviously I approached this as an individual person. And I think the process or relationships that I was exploring were sort of my own, as they are connected with other agents, though, mostly in this case non-human and more than human, and as well as like the indigenous people whose memories I was trying to work with. So I think I'm trying to answer what you're saying, but I'm not exactly sure if I am. But I see the contradiction, and I think the way that I would answer it is through that relational lens again, and say like, I was exploring myself in a relational way as related to all of these things that are acting on me as much as I'm acting on them. And so maybe you could consider it a research co-production, in that the land is what was really sort of working on me or disrupting me as much as I was thinking I was disrupting that or working on that. I don't know if that answers it at all. That was hard.
Answer. I just think as we move into relationality, where you're really shifting the focal point, it poses challenges in terms of what is the research process look like. And I think I'm impressed, you know, you're really trying to figure that out. I think it's interesting, but it also you know, like, how do you make visible the connection rather than the kind of recipient of a relationship, and how do you shift that focus and make that kind of tangible enough for the research process? But I think it's not a critique, it's more just a comment.
And that's been expressed a little bit in at least some of the research that I've been reading about, or some of the articles I've been reading about, like relational paradigm and sustainability, or looking more towards relational research for sustainability. And I think it's really important to consider, because I mean, and I don't know if this is exactly where you were going, but it came to my mind is, you know, sustainability is a solutions-oriented science, right? And we're trying to produce things that are going to make an impact, like an urgent, you know, we're trying to deal with urgent issues. And so there's a critique like, well, is relationality really just going to distract us from doing this work, like that really needs solutions, you know, yesterday? And I think that's valid. It's definitely something that we need to think about. Some of the replies that I've seen to that, which is where more I'm coming from, is that we can kind of do both. And there are avenues for sort of, you know, exploring relationality more in this way of trying to figure out more of like, how do we do this research, and, you know, sort of showcase processes and relationships and the connections versus actual outcomes. And yeah, I don't have like a specific answer either, but I think that it's a really important thing to consider, and there's a lot of room to kind of work between those things. So yeah.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for your time and for coming today. Thank you, Brian and Leah, for a wonderful presentation. If you guys have any other questions or concerns, feel free to carry them with you outside to the atrium. There'll be some refreshments and beverages, so please enjoy yourselves, but thank you all for coming.